Welcome back to our Preseen material go through again. Now, if you kindly turn to page 3 of the Preseen material that we are starting off by looking at electric cars. Now, first things first, if you kindly turn to page 9 of our Preseen application notes, the first paragraph that we are told the electric cars starting from 1920s. Now, it seems to me that's a bit weird because up until 2000, I can't see any electric cars, although it started from 1920s. But why this was the case? The reason is the electric starter motor really replaces the electric cars. In the early 19,000s, the electric cars were seen to be better than the fuel power cars. But at that time, when we start the engine, we will need to crank the car. Crank the car in order to start it. Now, how do we crank it? It's like using our hand and cranking the, for example, the handler in order to start the engine. Particularly in periods that we feel very cold, it may take a few minutes for us to do that. However, from 1920s, the electric starter motor came into being. And of course, this helps human beings not cranking the car manually and saving a lot of time, really, because it's using the electric one at the same time, such as Ford Model T was produced using the assembly line production, which means in a mass production method. So what that means is it really spread the fixed costs over the increased number of models that it produced each and every time. So for example, reducing a lot of human errors. Now remember, when we were producing cars, before the assembly line production method, we relied on human beings. If we relied on human beings, they tend to make mistakes. So what assembly line production actually did would be to break down the total task into more than 7,000 subtasks. So using a scientific management method, allowing the staff to produce what they really specialize and to reduce the error rate. This proved to be working at that time quite a lot. So therefore, it really brings down the costs and hence the selling price of each car compared to the electric car. But hold on a second. Electric cars, well, they're environmentally friendly. Yes, you're right, but they are quite expensive. But expensive in what area? Expensive in its own battery. So therefore, using assembly line production method, it really reduced a lot of costs, including the raw material costs, because the company can now make bulk purchase of raw materials and enjoying the discounts from the suppliers. So therefore, to us, it's very important that we need to bear in mind there are two lessons that we can learn from this, okay? So firstly, if you're simply focusing on the technology or the tech, any advances in tech does not mean that you can win the market, you can win the customer. The reason is the current problem of using electric car in this market is all about the range issue. That we can see that one of our company's models is called Tiny, with a range of just 143 kilometers. So I would say that this may not be an advantage to our company. So how can we solve the issues that customers really care about would be the very key. So at the same time, we can notice that there will be improvements over the years. So that's why when we are thinking about the materials or the raw materials, we will need to diversify it. So in other words, we need to avoid reliance on a single supplier for the raw material. So for example, if we were to rely on, so for example, the cobalt material in our battery. The cobalt usually comes from Canada. Alternatively, the lithium material coming from Australia. Now, if those countries stopped exporting these materials to our company, so if that's the case, then that would be a disaster to our company. So, of course, in order to diversify our suppliers, of course, we'll need to face certain levels of foreign exchange rate risks. So that's why it's one of the very important areas in our SCS syllabus that we need to recap on later on. All right? Now, this is what the first paragraph is all about. Now, let's now look at the second paragraph here. Now, we are told that very little interest in electric cars throughout the century up until 2000. For example, the forklift trucks has been powered by electricity for many years. They can operate efficiently indoors and without damaging the environment, so for example. Now, the paragraph, I'll analyze it by looking at something that is out of the box, which means I know that the technology and our tastes will be changing over time. So what would be the next breakthrough? Well, this is a very interesting question. Now, what I would like to guess is this. I would like to guess that battery technology is not just about the range issue that we just talked about before. But the next breakthrough for that is, can you achieve ultra-fast charging situation? That would be the very key. So for example, if you're only taking, let's say 3 minutes, 5 minutes to recharge your battery, that's the technology that our competitors cannot easily copy. And of course, when we are thinking about the charging infrastructure, traditionally we may be thinking that we need to have lots and lots of these infrastructures in place in order to make sure that our cars can be sold. But this is not enough. Not only do we need to ensure there will be high density, which means that we can cover that everywhere, but also we'll need to think about whether or not the charging infrastructure is reliable. So for example, if any errors made, we can fix them instantly. So for example, if we cannot make the payment from there, so are there any after-sales support that can directly solve this issue for us? Or using AI, okay, chatbot, that we can fix the issue as soon as possible. Now, not only for that, we also need to think about the standard, which means the charging infrastructure, is it only suitable for one particular type of car or for all models? Now, if it is for all models, that would be our competitive advantage, okay? The increasing possibly the sales volume of our cars. So therefore, I would say that the next breakthrough is to think about what customer really needs. So that's why, instead of using the reactive approach, waiting for the infrastructure in place before we sell our cars, why not proactively working with government to build this infrastructure, at the same time to work with third-party partners, that, for example, using a joint venture way to spread our costs and to spread our risks for that. That would be another clever idea that you need to think about on the exam day. Right. Now, next one. If you kindly turn to page number 11 of our Preseen application notes, we know that until 2000, a number of manufacturers launching the new models. Now, they're faced with a choice about internal combustion engines using petrol, diesel, or electric cars, or a combination of that. Alright. And of course, government played a very important role in banning those fuel-powered cars very soon. Now, of course, the thing that we need to analyse would be this. In order to drive up the sale, we cannot just think about how to pull the customer, which means thinking about the demand side from a customer. But also, we'll need to think about, from a government's point of view, are there any policies in place affecting our demand? Now, of course, when talking about the demand side force, we know that before 2000, because of decreasing costs, because of the assembly line production method by Ford, it brought down the selling price of each model, and it was fine. So therefore, fuel-powered cars played a very important role before 2000. Alright, so we all know that. But now, we've got another excuse that we need to think about the environment. Oh, if you want to think about the environment, why wouldn't you think about the environment back in before 2000? So that's why we know that the customer tastes and the opinions will be changing over time. I would say that we are not particularly sure what is right. At least for me, I don't know what is right. What I need to know is that we need to follow the market. And that is what I mean by demand side. We need to look at what customers really want. Now, at the same time, when we are thinking about the supply side force, we will need to think about the policies by government. We all know that the government hates fuel-powered cars because one good excuse would be that it is damaging the environment, and so on. But hold on a second. If we were to use the electric cars For example, the relying on the battery. Guess what? Certain materials, so for example, a good example for this will be the cobalt. The cobalt material used in battery actually comes from the countries, for example, Congo. And a lot of smaller entities, for example, the mining cobalt material in Congo, they did use child labour, abusing human rights. So if that's the case, then you need to rely on this to a certain extent. Would that be a problem? Well, we need to think about that from an ethics point of view. If I'm the examiner of the SCS, I will certainly set a very interesting question on this area and asking you to comment on that. But luckily, I'm not the examiner. Now, not only for that, well, we also need to think about to the customer. To the customer side. What do you think? Do customers really care about the environment? Well, I would say that possibly yes, but at least not all of them. Their tastes will be changing over time. Perhaps I would guess that they may want smarter and more environmentally friendly cars. What does that mean? Well, if I'm the customer, I do want the cars to be smarter and less costs and less trouble. So for example, if you want me to use the electric car, it's fine, but don't charge me the high price. One way of doing so, per the best practice nowadays in the industry, would be that for any unused electricity, what we can do is that through a particular system, so for example, it's the energy management system, we can feed the unused or surplus electricity back to the grid. We can save that to a certain extent, and this is what I mean by more environmentally friendly one. I mean from a customer's point of view. Of course, from the government's point of view, they do really care about the carbon dioxide emissions. But from a customer's point of view, I do believe they care about something else. So that leads us to page 12. I'd like to share with you a very interesting story from the UK that back in 2020, the UK government announced that in 2040, I would like to ban the fuel-powered cars. But in 2020, they adjusted the goal. I would like to ban the fuel-powered cars in 2030. Well, what do you think? I would say that that is a disaster. The reason is, firstly, nowadays, a lot of UK families are facing a particular issue, the rising living costs. So, unluckily, the electric cars are very expensive. Even more expensive than traditional fuel-powered cars. So if that's the case, they would like to ban it, and for example in 2030, it's like 5 years later, can these people afford an electric car? So that's the big problem that you need to think about there. Now, not just for that, if you were to ban this, how about for the old apartment? Do they have the charging infrastructure in place? It's less likely that you will have the charging infrastructure building in the old apartment areas. So that's another problem that you need to think about. Now, the third problem, of course, you can't ignore. A major stakeholder group would be the car companies. The car companies say that in the UK that we survived for more than 100 years in the car industry, that relying on the fuel-powered models. But now you would like to change them all. What if, for some of the car industry companies, that they don't have the ability to invest heavily in the R&D related to the electric cars? What do you think? Guess what? Of course, they will suffer. Of course, losing many jobs. Can government solve this problem? So therefore, the UK government then adjusted the goal back in 2023 that in 2035 they would like to ban the fuel-powered cars. Alright then, what do you think? What would be the implication to our company? I would say that the biggest implication from my perspective is that the changing policy. Please do not expect that the policy will remain static. The policy may be subject to change. So therefore, we will need to keep an eye on to certain figures. So for example, we will need to monitor the inflation level, which will affect the living costs of a given country. And even the disposable income, for example, after deducting all these necessary expenses, how much money you still got for your personal use, for the family use. This will also determine the living costs in there, and to see the next move by the next government, for example. And of course, keep an eye on to the timetable announced by the government in terms of replacing the fuel-powered cars with the electric ones, whether or not you are able to keep up with the R&D investment, okay, and introduce your new ones into the market. And that's very, very important there. All right. Now, let's now move on to different types of electric cars. All right. So firstly, that we've got battery electric cars. All right. So if you kindly turn to page number 30 of our Preseen application notes, I would like to tell you more about the battery itself. Now, a famous case, as you can see in this picture, really took place in a country called Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, what they did is that lots of smaller size companies that mining cobalt material, which is an important material in battery, they did not really follow the rules and laws entirely. Sometimes a lot of these companies abused human rights. Because, for example, in terms of the workforce themselves, we can see that estimated 40,000 children were used. At the same time, the conditions are appalling. It's very, very surprising and shocked, okay, if anyone can see that. So, the environment is very, very dangerous. At the same time, they are paying the child labour on a daily basis, like $1 to $2, working in dangerous environment. So if that's the case, then okay, we need these sort of materials in our battery. how could we do about it? Well, one of the ways that we can do is that audit that. Do you think that's possible? I would say that if your company is not going to do something that is on a proactive basis by simply checking what went wrong, this means that it's very tough for you to do that. Because don't forget, companies may be buying the cobalt materials from these smaller entities which did not prepare for the account at all, which did not record anything at all. So how could you audit that? If you simply audit that, so for example using a local auditor, it's very likely that they are lying. So therefore the implication to our firm, possibly, I would guess, why not to do something that is more of a vertical integration. With a supplier. So for example, what we would do is that if we decided to use the cobalt materials in our battery, why not just working with larger suppliers in that country? Larger suppliers, of course, subject to audit. At the same time, we'd like to sign exclusive contract and making everything transparent. Which means that on a fair basis, okay, so possibly that we need to focus on in our integrated report disclosure and even in our sustainability reports and policies as well. So that could be one of the potential strategic alliance question coming up in the SCS exam. At the same time, something that's relating to the sustainability issues. And of course, another way to our business is that we can change the technology. So for example, reducing the cobalt material. So for example, to think about on page number 14, to think about more of the lithium and nickel materials in our battery production. But what do you think? Is that a good choice? Well, I would say that lithium really affects the environment in a negative way because it really consumes quite a lot of water resources. So if you like to protect the environment but lithium would not be okay, the reason is you usually buy the lithium material from South America countries, so for example from Chile, from Argentina, and also Bolivia. So, which means the lithium triangle, which means the major three countries that you can buy the materials from. Now at the same time, you will need to, buy the lithium material and it is mined from the brine pools. Now it's the salty pools that the brine pools includes the minerals such as the lithium, and you need to extract that. If you were to extract that, you will need to consume quite lots of water resources in there. How about the nickel? Like to use nickel. What do you think? Well, it seems to me that's fine. However, it's not good for the environment because it emits a lot of sulfur dioxide, which is damaging the air in the environment. It's not a good choice as well. So therefore, everything seems to be an issue if we were to rely on battery. Now, looking back to the question again, before 2000, all right, we focus on power fuel costs, and after 2000, okay, we need to think about something that is more ethical and something that is more environmentally friendly. What do you think? Is that a lie? Perhaps I can't say that it's a lie, but my gut feeling tells me that something is not right. Something's not making sense. Because we are working in these companies, so that's why we need to think these issues in the best interest for shareholders. Anyway, now, that being the case, if you're utilizing these materials in your battery production, I would say that think about the government policy. Do you think that they would like to set up stricter rules? Of course, the answer will be definitely yes. So our focus is never about the likelihood that the government policy will be stricter, will be tighter. I would care very much about when, which means the timing of these policies, or stricter or tighter policies, that will come into being. And this is our focus. And of course, when we are working in the best interest of a company, we always need to find and to look for alternative materials, replacing the materials, for example, such as these sort of materials that are listed there. Okay, so a heavy investment in R&D, research and development, would be necessary. All right, now we're also told in the next paragraph that the cars can be recharged at their drivers' homes. Unfortunately, difficult to recover if running out of charge, okay, if they are not at the recharging point. Now, a good example on page number 15 I'd like to share with you is from the UK, is the Automobile Association. Now, what it did is that if a car has problems, it cannot drive that, so for example, running out of petrol or electricity. Of course, for the few powered cars, it would be relatively straightforward. Now, what AA did would be to tow the car in a traditional way, all right, such as this. However, for the electric cars, we cannot do it in the same way, because the only option would be to call for a third-party flatbed truck. Of course, higher costs on that if the electric car runs out of battery. The battery is dead, for example, when there's no, no recharging point next to that, for example. We will need to put that into the flatbed truck. We cannot simply tow it in this particular way, because if we were to treat that as the traditional fuel-powered cars and drag it, which means to tow it in this way, that it would damage its electric motor. What AA did, firstly, it developed a particular device attaching to the wheels and allowing the wheels to spin freely without engaging the electric motor. So that's why if we were to drag in this way by AA, it did not hurt the electric motor, and that's fine. Secondly, a more clever idea is to launch a fleet of vans equipped with mobile chargers. Okay, so this means that you're running out of battery, the battery is dead. All right, I'm going to be charging a battery. Okay, I'm using the movable or the mobile chargers, okay, to charge your cars instantly, for example, to solve the problem. That is a clever idea. Now, of course, as I said before, that if I were to sell my car, so for example in this company, it's very important that you need to think about the after-sales services, such as the service that we provide that don't worry about cars, we've got a team who can fix your problem if you can't find any recharging points next to you. Now, we're also told in the next paragraph that the range will vary. We all know that. Alright. On page number 16 of our Preseen application notes, I would like to share with you another story about Tesla, the battery gate problem. Now, of course, Tesla has certain problems in a few years ago, so particularly the car fire in Shanghai taken place many years ago. What Tesla did later on will be to conduct the mandatory updates on all the software installed in the Tesla's cars. So Tesla says to the customer that by updating the software, the shelf life will improve. However, the range will reduce. Of course, this hurt a lot of customers' interests, I would say. So that's why a lot of customers sued Tesla. So back in 2021, a court in Norway ruled Tesla to pay $16,000 to the affected users. Of course, the broader implication is that we introduced a term called right to repair movement. So a lot of users would demand more control over its car rather than listen to you that you need to install the mandatory updates without our agreement. And of course, to us, the implication is that we will need to think about the compliance issue and even the communication issue. We need to make things more transparent to the user, okay, at the very first beginning, rather than the users finding out problems and sue us back. So this is very important. I will say that yes, this industry is rather complicated, but hopefully I've given you enough information for you to think about in this particular industry before we move on to page number 4. And I look forward to seeing you soon then in the next of the recording. Bye-bye.
APC, accounting for your future.